Hello, and welcome back to Starlight Sleep Tales. Tonight we begin with a child who, by every reasonable expectation, was never supposed to arrive at all. For 23 years, the King and Queen of France had failed to produce an heir. The court whispered about it, foreign ambassadors wrote home about it, and then, against all the odds, a boy was born. A relieved nation decided almost instantly that he had to be a gift from heaven. They even named him after the idea. His real life, as it turned out, would be longer, stranger, and far more demanding than any miracle story. But it started with a country simply exhaling in relief. If these slow walks through history help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy it, no pressure tonight at all. And if you're in the mood, drop your town and your local time in the comments. It's a small thing, but it helps other people who can't sleep find their way here. And honestly, there's something comforting about knowing strangers in other cities are settling in for the very same story tonight. So get comfortable. Let the room go soft and dim, and let yourself drift slowly into the long life of Louis XIV, the man they would one day call the Sun King. He was born on the 5th of September, 1638, at the Royal Chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just west of Paris. The country he was born into was tense, ambitious, and exhausted all at once. France in those years held somewhere around 18 to 20 million people, far more than England or Spain, but it wasn't yet the polished power it would later become. It was more like a patchwork of provinces, each clinging to its own customs, its own courts, its own stubborn local pride. The roads were poor, the taxes fell unevenly, and real authority often belonged less to the king in Paris than to the great noble families who held land, soldiers, and grudges out in the countryside. On the throne sat his father, Louis XIII, a serious, often gloomy man who'd spent most of his reign struggling just to assert himself. Because the true engine of government wasn't the king, it was his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu. Thin, sharp, tireless, a churchman who thought like a general. Richelieu had one great obsession: the power of the French crown. He spent years pulling authority away from the nobles, crushing rebellions, and dragging France into that long, brutal European struggle we now call the 30 Years' War, fighting mainly against the Habsburg rulers of Spain and Austria. It was a grinding conflict. It ate money and men without mercy. And into this world, the Queen, Anne of Austria, finally gave birth. She was, by birth, a Spanish princess, daughter of the King of Spain, which made her marriage to a French king a genuinely delicate thing at a time when France and Spain were enemies. For more than 2 decades, her childlessness had practically been treated as a national crisis. An heir meant stability. No heir meant that if the king died, the crown might pass to his brother Gaston, a charming, thoroughly unreliable man with a long habit of plotting against his own family. So when the queen finally carried a child to term, the whole kingdom watched the way you watch a candle in a draft. The baby was healthy, and the celebrations were enormous. Bells rang across France. Bonfires lit up the streets. The boy was christened Louis and given the second name Dieudonné, which simply means God-given. There's a small detail courtiers love to repeat. The infant was said to have been born with 2 teeth already showing, which his nurses did not exactly appreciate. since it meant that feeding the future master of France was an early test of patience. Whether that story is entirely true or politely exaggerated, well, it suited the mood. People wanted to believe this child was special before he'd done a single thing. He wasn't an only child for long. A second son, Philippe, followed 2 years later, quietly solving the succession problem and giving the future king a brother who would shadow him for the rest of his life. But it was the first boy who mattered most, because in that age, everything flowed from the eldest son of the king. The France surrounding this royal cradle was a place of sharp contrasts. At the top sat a tiny circle of dukes and princes and great officers of the crown, men who could raise private armies and still half believed a king was only the first among equals. Below them spread a wider layer of lesser nobles, judges, and royal officials, many of whom had simply bought their offices and treated them as private property to hand down to their sons. And beneath all of them, carrying the entire weight, were the peasants, the great mass of French people who farmed the land, paid most of the taxes, and were rarely consulted about anything. The cities held merchants and craftsmen and a restless population that could turn dangerous the moment bread grew scarce. And holding the whole arrangement together was the Catholic Church, immensely rich, deeply woven into daily life, a power all its own. Richelieu's France was learning to centralize, but it wasn't there yet. The Cardinal had built a network of royal agents called intendants, sent out into the provinces to enforce the king's will and collect his money. The nobles hated them, and the resentment that built up under Richelieu didn't just disappear, it waited. And it would surface again in the childhood of the boy now sleeping at Saint-Germain. The infant prince, of course, would remember none of this. His earliest years passed among nurses, governesses, and the strict ceremony that already governed even a royal baby's day. His mother adored him. She was warm, devout, and would prove far tougher than anyone expected. His father, the king, stayed distant and unwell, more at ease with hunting and music than with the difficult work of affection. Then, in the winter of 1642, the man who had truly run France for nearly 20 years finally wore out. Cardinal Richelieu died in December, leaving behind a kingdom stronger and more feared abroad, but strained and full of buried anger at home. Before he died, he recommended a successor, an Italian-born churchman named Jules Mazarin. Smooth where Richelieu had been severe, just as patient. The old king didn't outlive his minister by much. Louis XIII had been ill for years, and his strength drained away through the spring of 1643. He knew the danger of leaving a small child on the throne, and he tried carefully to arrange the government, hoping to limit just how much power his wife and the new cardinal would hold. It was a sensible plan, and it would last only a matter of days. On the 14th of May, 1643, Louis XIII died, and in that instant, the boy born as a gift to a desperate nation became its king. He was 4 years and 8 months old. He couldn't read a treaty, couldn't command a soldier, couldn't even fully understand what had just happened to him. But the crown of France had passed into his small hands anyway, and an entire kingdom now bowed to a child who still needed help climbing into his own chair, a throne at age 4. A child obviously cannot govern a kingdom, and everyone around him knew it. So in the days right after the old king's death, the real question wasn't who wore the crown. It was who would hold the power in the boy's name. Louis XIII had tried to answer that question himself. In his final weeks, he'd drawn up arrangements meant to limit his widow, sharing authority among a council so that no single person, least of all the Queen, could rule unchecked. He simply didn't trust Anne of Austria with the whole of France. And given the politics of the moment, you can understand why. His plan lasted less than a week. Anne moved fast and cleverly. She brought the little king before the Parlement of Paris, the kingdom's highest law court, and had the dead king's will quietly set aside. The judges, flattered to feel important, granted her full powers as regent. A neat little lesson in how quickly the wishes of a dead king can evaporate once he's no longer in the room. From that moment, Anne of Austria governed France, and her son sat on the throne as a small, watchful presence, whose signature meant whatever the adults around him decided it should mean. The court fully expected her to dismiss Cardinal Mazarin. He'd been Richelieu's man, foreign-born, and most assumed the Queen would sweep him out and rule through her own friends. Instead, she did the exact opposite. She kept Mazarin as chief minister and leaned on him completely. The partnership between the Spanish-born Queen and the Italian-born Cardinal would run France for the next 18 years. So close, in fact, that people whispered the two were secretly married. A rumor never proven, and never quite dead either. What we do know for certain is that they trusted each other, and together they decided how the young king would be raised, and how the kingdom would be run. Mazarin became far more than a minister to the boy. He was made the king's godfather, and in practice his guardian and teacher in the craft of ruling. A very different man from Richelieu. Where the old cardinal had been cold and forbidding, Mazarin was charming, flexible, endlessly subtle. He smiled, he flattered, he delayed, he negotiated. He also gathered an enormous personal fortune along the way, which did nothing for his popularity. But he understood power, and he set out to teach young Louis how it actually worked, not just from books, but by letting the boy watch him handle crisis after crisis, year after year. And those crises came thick and fast, because the kingdom Anne and Mazarin inherited was still at war. The long struggle against the Habsburgs of Spain and Austria had been grinding on for a generation. And yet, almost as if to bless the new reign, French armies started winning. Only days after the little king took the throne, a brilliant young general, the Duke of Enghien, later known as the Great Condé, smashed a famous Spanish army at the Battle of Rocroi in the spring of 1643. A stunning victory, and it announced that France was becoming the leading military power in Europe. The boy king was far too young to understand any of it, but the soldiers who won that day would loom large in his later life, sometimes as heroes, sometimes as real danger. For 5 more years, the wider European war dragged toward its close. Finally, in 1648, the exhausted powers signed the Peace of Westphalia, a vast settlement that ended the 30 Years' War and reshaped the map of Central Europe. France emerged with new territory and enormous prestige. On paper, the regency looked like a triumph. The young king's ministers had inherited a war and won it. They'd ended a generation of fighting on favorable terms. Abroad, France looked stronger than it had in living memory. At home, though, the picture was uglier. Wars are paid for with taxes and loans, and the regency had spent without much restraint. Mazarin kept using Richelieu's old methods to squeeze money out of the kingdom, raising old taxes, inventing new ones, selling royal offices and titles to anyone who could pay. It filled the treasury for a moment, but it mortgaged the future. He also delayed paying the salaries owed to the very judges and officials who had granted Anne her powers in the first place. People up and down French society felt the pressure. Peasants groaned under the weight of it, as they always did. But this time, the discontent climbed higher, into the law courts, into the great noble houses, into exactly the people who had the standing to actually resist. Meanwhile, the boy at the center of it all was growing up in oddly mixed conditions. He was the most important person in France, surrounded by ceremony the moment he woke each morning. And yet money was so tight, and Mazarin so careful with it, that the young king's own household was sometimes downright shabby. There are accounts of worn sheets and threadbare furnishings in the apartments of a boy, treated like a god in public and pinched at home. He learned the outward forms of majesty long before he ever held real power. And he learned early to keep his thoughts to himself, watching the adults maneuver around him. His education leaned practical rather than scholarly. He was never going to be a great reader of philosophy, and his tutors didn't push him hard on Latin or theology. What Mazarin actually cared about was that the boy learn how kingship worked, how to read people, how to weigh advice, how to wait. The Cardinal brought young Louis into council meetings and let him sit through the daily grind of governing. At the time, it looked unremarkable. Looking back, it turned out to be one of the most thorough educations in statecraft any European monarch ever received.